Welcome to So Very Easy. My name is Laura, and I have found a really fun pattern from the Fat Quarter Shop. Now, this pattern is, well, for ties, so it'd be great for anyone who likes ties. And if we start it now, we can get it done in time for Father's Day. Now, this pattern is a table runner. It's 15.5 by 30.5. But if we wanted to, we could just do one and add a little bit of fabric for a placemat, or do two as placemats. We could take one, put sides around it, and even make it into a pillow. There are lots of different things we could do with this pattern. And I have found another way to use this pattern, but this time, instead of making the ties out of this black fabric, I might as well use ties. The pattern is called Black Tie Affair. So it was designed so that we could use fabric that would be a pattern of a tie, and then use some white fabric or a fabric that we would normally associate with shirts. So we have the collars, the shirts, and the ties. The pattern is designed around this 30-degree ruler, and that ruler is to make this shape. But we do have those collars. So with a little imagination, if we don't have that ruler, I'm sure we can design our own tie. And since I already have some ties, I'm going to use those. The first thing we need to start with is 3 pieces of fabric, 15.5 inches by 10.5 inches. Now, if you're making less or more than, you can adjust that. And I will be making 3, so I do have 3 different whites that I'll be using. I have my 3 rectangles cut out. Now I get to work on the collars. I will be doing collars out of matching fabric. In the pattern, they do have them done with a fusible web, and then we'll be able to glue those onto the back fabric. But for mine, I would like to make them dimensional. So I'll need to take and make a template out of this piece. We have the left and the right side, but because we only have the one and then we get to flip it over, I need to make one template. And that's going to give me the left and the right. I'll be tracing this collar out on the fabric, but I'm going to double that fabric. So I will have 2 pieces with the right sides touching, and it is the same fabric. Just draw right on this fabric 2 collars. One in one direction, and flip it over and do the other direction. With these 2 layers together, I will stitch all the way around both shapes. Then I'm going to turn them right side out. In order to do that, I need to have an opening. So I'll put a little opening along the back. So I can do that before I stitch them. This is going to be the back. So I'm going to put a little cut in one and a little cut in the other. These cuts are just big enough to turn it right side out. Now I'm going to put those layers together and stitch all the way around. Once we've stitched all the way around, trim a 1/4 inch seam allowance. On these little corners, we need to just trim off this little point. Now you want to get right close to that corner of stitching, but we don't want to stitch into the stitching. Now from this little hole we made, we can turn this all right side out and poke out those corners. We will not need to worry about closing up this hole because that will be going on the back side. We can now press this. You can stitch around this edge now, or you can stitch around it later. So this little round area is going to be the top, and the tie is going to come through. And that collar will go on that fabric. I now am going to add the tie. When we undo that stitching, we usually have a little bit of a silk end and a liner. So we're going to be able to remove that liner and just fold in a seam allowance. And once that's pressed, it gives us a big tie, which is pretty much the same size as that larger point. It's just going to have less bulk inside. So we need to decide how long we're going to want that tie. We can just judge it this way. For the top, we can add a pleat, and that pleat is going to make it look more like a tie. And just put a little pin up at the top. And before we put that collar on, we do need to make a knot. So I've just cut a little piece, and that was just on that end. And I'm going to put it over here. So it's going to cover. Then I can put my collar on. Once I know where this is going to fit, I'm going to be able to stitch around. But I'm going to stitch one piece at a time. I'll top stitch all the way around and top stitch this coming in. Place that second piece on. We can also add a little fold in the top. It gives it a round shape, just like a knot would have. So we're going to stitch this tie on first, stitch the knot on, then I can put on that collar. If we've already stitched on this collar, we're going to do a second row of stitching just a little bit beside it. A lot of men's shirts do have a double row of stitching. If you chose to stitch this all down at once, then you're going to have one row of stitching go all the way around. So here's a close-up of the top. I have some folds at the top of the tie and some little folds right in that knot. When we put that collar on, it's going to cover all of that stitching. And we can adjust where we want to have that collar. Just remember, we will need a seam allowance all the way around. Here's a collar with those 2 rows of stitching done. And this is what it looks like with 1 row of stitching. The pattern does have us just sew those together in a row, and I'm definitely going to do that. And then I will take the ties, and I'm going to use that tie fabric for binding all the way around. One thing to keep in mind when you are ironing original ties is the fabric. So be sure to have your iron set for the fabric in this tie. We don't want to melt the tie and ruin the iron. So now I get to sew these together. This pattern gives us a lot of different possibilities. We can use original shirts and original ties, or just have fun and use some really fun fabric. My husband loves to fish and he loves to cook, so I could make those ties in fabrics that I think that he would enjoy. And if you're sewing it for a woman, there's nothing saying you cannot have some flowers and some fun prints for a woman's tie. Because after all, a tie's not just for a man. I'll put a link in the description to the pattern, and I'd love to know what you would do with it and how would you change it. But in the meanwhile, I do have my ties done. And to quilt this, I think I'm going to treat each panel separate. Do stripes in one, checks in another, and maybe some swirls or paisleys in the third. And that way, it's like 3 individual shirts. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe and come on back. Let's see what we're working on next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.